This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week we'll hear Koom's interview with Peter Bagge, creator of the comic Hate. This was recorded in a public spotlight event at Toronto Comicon earlier this spring. You'll hear Peter Bagge talk about how he got interested in Margaret Sanger, the subject of his book Woman Rebel, and Zora Neale Hurston, the focus of his latest book, Fire. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. The next voice you hear will be Peter Bagge.
I once did a panel in Detroit. I didn't even know I was going to do a panel. They just said, starting now is a panel for Peter Bagge. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went to the room where the panel's supposed to be. There's one person. One person was sitting there. And so I walk up, and the guy's just sitting right in front of me. And I walk up on stage, and it's like, well, you're here. Do you really want me to do a presentation and talk myself? And the guy went, honestly, I'm just here to rest my feet. No, I went back.
Well, I think this is the hottest event at Comic-Con this weekend, maybe this year, so I don't know what people are doing.
The decade.
They're out there like clutching their overpriced figurines and taking cosplay selfies, the fools. Okay, so thanks so much for coming. Maybe because it's such an intimate group, we could actually get more audience participation if that works out. So we've got here Peter Bagge, one of the leading lights of his generation. Peter's unusual in that he's like the high school kid who doesn't belong to a particular clique. He's confident, comfortable talking to the jocks, but he's also hanging out behind the school, smoking drugs and skipping class. He's worked with Robert Crumb and edited Weirdo. He's self-published with friends and by himself. He's been published over the years with one of the two greatest indie publishers, Fantagraphics, and he's been at the vanguard of their publishing efforts in history. He's been published by mover and shaker Dark Horse. He's released a best-selling biography about Margaret Sanger with Drawn and Quarterly, and now he's got his new one, Fire, with 2 exclamation marks about Zora Neale Hurston, which I'm sure will do just as well, if not better. And he's also worked with DC and Marvel. So it's like check, 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 every possible box you could check.
Not Image yet.
Thank God. I'm kidding. They've turned around. So it's not like the guy who was hanging out behind the school smoking drugs is now dating everybody on the cheerleading squad all at the same time. So let's welcome Peter Bagge.
Thank you.
So I read your stuff, as I told you, in the 90s, the Hate stuff, and it really stayed in my mind. And I read some of your stuff in some future years, but I hadn't really kept up with what you were doing recently. So when I was preparing for this interview and catching up, I was just amazed at the recent direction your work's been taking, especially in terms of these biographies about women. And so you've been talking also in interviews that you've been giving out recently about your libertarian politics, which is not a new thing, but it feels like that's becoming more and more a part of recent interviews. So I thought I'd get you to start off talking about the direction that your new stuff's going in.
Right, okay. So should we just start off with the more recent work and what led to Hurston?
Yeah, I feel like people probably know his older stuff here, right? Do you all know Neat Stuff and Hate and Weirdo and stuff? Yeah, so let's start off with the fire stuff then.
Okay. Well, the reason I have this apocalypse nerd up is the previous decade I did 3 actual graphic novels. I did 3 novel stories, novel and comic stories, one of which was Apocalypse Nerd, which originally was serialized. And I kept finding myself having extra pages in the back of each issue, so I would do these little things that I called Founding Fathers Funnies. And this is one of them. At the time I was reading a lot of biographies about the Founding Fathers, just for my own amusement. And while I'm an admirer, I also thought they were very funny. So I would try to capture their personalities, but also, try to milk it for laughs at the same time. But that's the cover for another graphic novel. I'm just going to, okay, there we go. And meanwhile, I was doing a lot of journalistic type comic strips for Reason magazine. And eventually with Reason magazine, they allowed me to do a 12-page biography of a woman named Isabel Patterson, who in the 20s and 30s was, and in 40s, was probably like the most influential book critic. But, and she also was a novelist herself. And reading about her got me interested in a lot of different women from that era, mainly writers from that era, mainly because they were so independent and they lived their lives the way it would seem normal for a woman to do now, but we would presume that women back then, before the 60s women's rights movement, it was presumed they weren't allowed to do a lot of things, or it was very socially unacceptable. But here I kept reading about women who just pretty much did whatever the hell they wanted, one being Isabel Patterson. So one of the things I noticed too about these women who were very independent is, and part of the reason they were able to live an independent life is none of them had babies. They didn't seem to be bogged down by pregnancies. So that got me interested in birth control from that time. I didn't know what was available, what existed. And that kept leading me to Margaret Sanger, who was, as I read about her, she was very similar to the women that I was actually researching, who were mainly writers. And I was so interested in her that when I started reading about her life story, it was so literally action-packed that I thought this is like comic book worthy. I thought Jordan Quarterly would be a likely candidate to publish it, mainly because I heard they offered generous advances. Fantagraphics, they're not very advancy. So, and the person who owned, back then who owned and started Jordan Quarterly, Chris Oliveros, he loved the idea. He wanted me to do a series of them. We were a bit foggy about which one to do first and settled on Women Rebel.
Were you surprised that it did so well?
Well, it's a very controversial figure, and also, if you're asking me, I thought the book came out terrific. So, yeah, I thought it would do okay, and they were comfortable too. And also, because of the subject matter, it's proven to be a bit of an evergreen. It still keeps selling. Schools will buy for the libraries, even middle schools.
Wow, that's
so
awesome.
Yeah, very progressive middle schools, obviously.
Yeah. Either that or middle schools where all the tweens are pregnant.
Right, because people were telling me that somebody told me that a high school that he teaches at, he wanted to order it and they wouldn't order it just because of the subject matter, or maybe there was one particular scene. I can't remember what scene it was. But anyhow, one person I always wanted to write about amongst mainly these women from this era was Zora Neale Hurston. And I don't know if all of you have ever heard of her prior to this. She's best known as, African-American writer from the South, born in 1891 and died in 1960. And so her heyday, her most productive creative period and her most successful period would have been the 1930s and early 40s. She was unique in countless reasons. One simply was that she was a black woman, and she came from a very, her beginnings were extremely humble, very small town in the South. Although she didn't grow up poor, her parents were, it was like an all-black town, and her father was the mayor. So, so education was highly valued in her family with her parents. Her parents were somewhat educated too, as much as educated as poor black people could be back then. And she always wanted to be educated. She was infinitely curious about everything, but she went through a long, very difficult period of trying to become educated. People just assumed, including her own brothers, who she later would live with, they would always make vague promises, like if they lived in a bigger city like Jacksonville, Memphis. They said, look, you come and stay with me and I'll make sure you're enrolled in the local school. And they usually never did. They usually used her as a free babysitter. But eventually she did, she got a job that allowed her to save enough money that she was able to enroll in high school. And she was 28 or 27 when she finally enrolled in high school. That's a lie. And from that point on in her life, she shaved off 10 years from her age. For the whole rest of her life, she got away with being 10 years younger than she was. And yeah, I should let you ask questions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I noticed about both books, if you haven't read the books, they're great, is that your main protagonists have a lot of moxie in them. So obviously you're not creating that because it's amply evident from the episodes that they're very strong-willed people.
Right.
Like there's a panel in Fire where Zora says, she's sitting underneath a tree and she goes, I need an education. She's
Right.
aware, she's got enough intelligence and fortitude to be aware of the lack to get to where she's going. And I was wondering if you were drawn to these characters because of their headstrong nature that seemed to be, God-given more than nurtured.
Right. And both of them did come from very impressive families. They both came from it was strange. Like Sanger came from a small town in upstate New York that was almost entirely Irish Catholic. It was like monocultural. She came from a small town in Central Florida that was 100% black and Baptist. So it was strange how quickly they became comfortable with the outside world and how adaptable they were once they started mixing and mingling with other types of people. And they never had, neither of them either, they never had any problem. They both were very socially fluid. Talking to rich people, poor people, people of all backgrounds and ethnicities. They were comfortable talking to anybody. They just were very confident in their own intelligence, I suppose. But yeah, when she eventually wound up going to Howard University, which was like, and I guess it still is considered the best, what they now call historically black universities in the United States. And again, her life had a lot of false starts. It took her quite a while to get to becoming a known published author. But by the 30s, by the 30s and early 40s, with the same publisher, she had written 4 novels and 2 collections of folklore. And that's another thing too I should get right to is while she eventually wound up going to college in Barnard in New York, which is affiliated with Columbia. So she wound up with an Ivy League education. She was always the first black person, let alone black woman, to go to Barnard. She wasn't the first black person to go to Columbia, but it was still very white then. And while she was at Columbia, she took a class with a Professor Franz Boas, who is like the father of modern anthropology. She became obsessed with anthropology, mainly because she saw how it would give her a new way to view and study her own people. She immediately thought, I want to go back to where I came from, or travel around the South and meet other African American communities. And she did. She got funding for it. So that's what this cover is about. She finally got a grant to go back down south and travel around. And then next to it, I have a black and white picture that was the inspiration for this cover. And this cover tells a lot about her. One was she, had a limited amount of grant money. The money wasn't going to last that far, but she almost blew all of it on the first day on a brand new Packard. She had a brother that convinced her to buy a used Model A. And And she had this wardrobe that was entirely white, I guess to be more comfortable while traveling around South. So all the pictures of her traveling the South, from head to toe, like I gave her a little bit of dark features, especially in the comic. But yeah, even white shoes. She just dressed white from head to toe. And she also bought a 6-shooter and a bullet belt and a holster for protection. That was her excuse for it. But to me, it seems like it was just
flamboyant.
Yeah, for show.
Yeah. I also just found it really interesting that she was never really great with money. Like she would do things like rent parties to pay the rent. So even though she was extremely gifted, extremely driven and ambitious and dedicated to creating a kind of black pride or a black culture, she'd always have these like personal things going on in her life that were.
Right.
So she was a really interesting character.
Right. And that's just that she would, if you asked her, do you have a problem with money? And she'd say no.
Or problem with people.
Yeah. No, or she would say, when I have money, I spend it. And when I don't, I borrow it. You know?
Yeah.
She's very, very flamboyant, notoriously late for meetings. Also a wild dresser. I talk in the introduction a bit about how I wish I could have, technically I could have, but I wish I could have drawn her the way she dressed. I had to tone it down because it was distracting. Because she did cosplay almost every day. It's like one day she'd be wearing a man's 3-piece suit, and the next day she'd be wearing like an Indian Seminole ceremonial outfit. And there'd be like no reason for either. It was always just she felt like it. She'd open up her closet and grab something. And somewhere in here, here's the back cover of my book was inspired by this. This is like, this and another photo taken that's just like this are the only color photographs I could find of her. And they were taken by probably her best friend, a white male photographer named Carl Van Vechten. And there was one weekend in Chicago where he took hundreds of photos of her. So most of the photos, if you're familiar with her, if you Google her name, almost all these photos were taken that weekend in Chicago. And so I came across this picture and just thought, what the hell is she wearing? It's like, what kind of outfit is that? And then later I read Van Vechten said that she was wearing what I guess she described as a traditional Norwegian skiing outfit. Now, why on earth would she be wearing that? But I guess she liked it, thought it was pretty, and there she was, walking around Chicago in a traditional Norwegian skiing outfit.
But on the other hand, she looks amazing, I think.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's the other thing, too.
Like, she would turn heads. You know?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yeah. I'm going to skip way ahead just to show one other picture. Sorry about skipping. Like here, so many of these pictures of her, you know, everything else is black and white, they're grainy. I blew these pictures up here. All of these are from the 30s, kind of like the height of her fame, so to speak, the mid-late 30s. But when I study these pictures very closely, like here she's not wearing anything crazy, but you know, like a Seminole outfit. But all of these outfits, when I look closely, they're very, very stylish and really expensive. So she, even though she usually had no money, she obviously spent a lot of it on clothes. In that middle one too, it's interesting, but the middle one, the necklace is still the same necklace that went with the Norwegian outfit. But that middle one too, she's dressed to the nines, and she's in the bleachers of a baseball game. You know, I only wish that people would dress like that to baseball games. And the one with the fur coat was taken by Van Vechten on that same weekend in Chicago. And then the one on the far right is her at a signing for an anthology she was in. And again, the outfit she's wearing there, just if you study it very closely, is really highfalutin.
I just also associate that with the 30s. I feel like they knew how to have fun, given the constraints of society.
Right. Their attitude towards dress was so much more different than it is now.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in the fact that you picked women as your subject, and I was thinking about Valerie and Lisa from Hate, you know, who were like really strong in my mind from the time when I read Hate. Do you see any kind of connection? Like, are you drawn to women in particular, or a kind of woman, or has your dealing with women characters changed since then and now? Or have you just picked women because these were women who had to kind of rail against their statuses to advocate the libertarian ideals that you're interested in?
Well, with all of my work that I've done previously, and except for these biographies, there's never been I haven't done a head count, but there never has been a big difference between how much I feature male characters or female characters. And I've probably had more male protagonists than female protagonists. Sure. But
don't you see that like characters like Val and Lisa, and I was also thinking about Lovey,
Yeah, sure.
There's a certain kind of satire going on there.
Right.
And then at this point, I don't feel like you totally take the case of your protagonist. Like I feel like you look at them with a kind of detachment and fascination, but you're not. I don't know. There's something more subtle going on now.
Well, again, with my earlier work, my work leading up to this, those characters that you named, they're based on people I know.
Right.
They're all amalgams of people I know,
right.
And I always found women to be. I always found them to be as funny and amusing and as unpredictable as men. At least certain women and maybe I don't. Maybe I find them funnier or more amusing or more interesting than a lot of other people do. But to me, it's like I know all of these human cartoon characters, several of whom I combined to make Lisa. Right. Who I feel is like the most complex character I ever worked with from Hate.
But at the same time, you're not like sucked into them like, say, the Hernandez brothers are. You don't seem to be caught in their tractor beam either.
I don't know how to answer that question. With the Hernandez brothers, I don't really wonder so much. It's just, but as to why they so heavily use female protagonists,
Sure.
I'm sure people have asked that question and they've answered it, but I can't remember if they even ever articulated a reason. But again, with these two women, and also the next book I'm working on,
what's the next book about?
It's Rose Wilder Lane, and I guess I could talk about a bit more about that later.
Yeah.
But it is partly because they are women that makes everything they did more impressive at that time. They were part and parcel of a lot of things that were going on. They were not involved, well, except with Sanger with birth control. You could argue that that's a women's issue, except that it isn't. People always talk about it as a women's issue these days, but men's lives have improved greatly with the advent of effective and easily accessible birth control, as women have benefited from it. And while she was an activist, half of her supporters, the people who were helping her, were men. It wasn't like this army of women pushing for birth control. As many men were as invested in that cause as women were, and as many women were against birth control as men were. It wasn't even after some critics have read and liked my Sanger book, they still talk about this gender divide, about this assumption that it's men that fight birth control as a way to control women, and it's women who are fighting for the rights of birth control rights. And that, based on everything I read about Margaret Sanger, that is absolutely untrue. Gender had nothing to do with it. But still, all of them were led by this tiny woman. And so it is just simply the novelty of a woman taking the lead. And the same with Zora Hurston. She became part of the Harlem Renaissance, which was a brief, bright period in New York that pretty much went from 1925 to 1930, and then the Depression killed it. But that's when all of a sudden there was this influx of black artists and writers and intellectuals all living in Harlem at the same time. She was there. She was part of it almost from the beginning. And so there were a handful of other women in that movement. But then, fast forward 10 years later, we are now, by 1934, we are now 5 years into the Great Depression. Not just the women that she knew, like the whole Harlem Renaissance scene is just obliterated. All the other women artists and writers she knew all became, either they got married and they were supported by their husband, or they got teaching jobs and just became part of a faculty, got tenured somewhere, and started a teaching career and rarely wrote after that, and certainly didn't try to make a living. Amazing thing about Hurston was, at that point, 1934, even though she hardly had any money, she was literally the only black woman in the United States that was trying to write on her own terms. And research discovered this. So her main biographer, Valerie Boyd, she couldn't find a single example at that time period in the early mid-30s of another woman doing what she was doing. Which, of course, there might have been writers who were like copywriters, newspaper editors or reporters, but writing for herself, writing her own stuff.
So singular.
Yes, she couldn't find a single writer with a capital W, black female writer, other than Hurston. But Hurston was so focused on what she wanted to do that she herself never addressed that. She never talked about that. She rarely talked, even though there's a strong feminist theme in a lot of her short stories, and in fact a lot of her best fiction has not an overt hit you over the head feminist theme, but it's definitely like it's a feminist theme. Like if you've ever read Their Eyes Were Watching God, it's semi-autobiographical, and it describes the life of a woman, largely based on Hurston, as she worked from being very dependent on one. It used men as milestones. It was almost like her first husband was almost an arranged marriage, an older man, but he had money. But of course he wound up being rather abusive. And then the next man, a bit of an improvement, until finally she winds up, like you asked me, wasn't there a character named Tea Cake? She winds up with Tea Cake, who's a million laughs, but and they have a lot of fun, and they have a wonderful relationship, but he also was a gambler. So there was a lot of craziness in their life too, until finally at the end, she's on her own, and she's been through everything, and she's at a point where it's like, I've been through so much that even though right now I don't have anything, I have no money, I know that I can handle anything that life throws at me. And if you haven't read this book, I just completely spoiled it for you.
Coming up, how does Bagge feel about the change in tone of his recent work compared to Hate? Just FYI, the second half of this interview has a few F-bombs that I'm not going to bleep, so be forewarned. But first, help Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles move up to bigger and better things. Pledge a few bucks a month via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. I'm trying to find a way to make podcasting into a career. Your pledges at Patreon can help make it happen, which would free me up to make that much more content. Help us out at patreon.com/deconcomics.
I'm Batman.
And I'm Robin.
This is Tim.
And this is Paul.
To the Bat Poles! The iTunes reviews are in on To the Bat Poles podcast. These guys do a good job, writes Acello. Who knew that the Batman TV show was such a wellspring of insight into Hollywood trivia, 60s counterculture, sexual mores, and even musical analysis? The Young brothers know their stuff, says Professor Allen. It is a great mix of nostalgia, analysis, and fun. Highly recommended. You've heard the reviews, now try it for yourself. New episodes on the first, third, and fifth Thursdays of the month on iTunes or Stitcher, or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com.
Batman, the answer to a policeman's prayer.
For nostalgia, analysis, and fun, it's
To the Bat Poles.
No, it's like the two books are similar. They're obviously part of a series or part of a phase in your life. But I found that with the first one, the politics of what Sanger was doing and the various stages of who she was connected with or what things she was fighting or what she was demonstrating against sort of drove the book. Whereas with the Hurston, when you explained that the politics was sort of there in the background but not in the foreground, that totally makes sense because I felt that this one was more electric. I mean, the other one was really interesting, but in this one you get a sense of a life that's really kind of connected between the episodes.
Right.
And also it's interesting because it's a person of color. Did you at all balk at taking on like not just a woman, but a woman of color living in a different time when things were like very, very racist?
Yeah, no, I thought about that. It's like it's already happened on Twitter, where it's like, this fucking white guy writing about a black woman.
You mean somebody said that about you?
Yeah, but it's also a guy that already hated me. So do you just want more reason to hate me?
Do you tweet, or did somebody tell you about that?
I just saw it. It just, it's like it's just a notification.
Okay.
But so it's like that was bound to happen.
Sure.
But I thought I had one very brief conversation with the publisher of Drawn and Quarterly, Chris Oliveros, where I finally decided, I think the next book will be about Zora Hurston. And he said, okay. And then I said, do you think that's a problem, me being a white guy writing about a black woman? Do you think that's a little, do you have a problem with it? And he says, I only have one question. Do you want to do it or do you not want to do it? Do you feel inspired to write about her or do you not? And I said, no, I do, I really do. And he says, well, then do it. And don't worry about it. He goes, anybody that's going to make an issue of that is a fucking asshole. So it's like, okay, I'll do it then. Nobody else is doing it. It reminds me of a guy I know in Seattle who wrote a book, that Fantagraph. It's not a comic book. It's called Listen Whitey, and it's a big coffee table book, and it's about vaguely it's about the Black Panther movement and the radical black movement from like the late 60s, early 70s, but more specifically about music and art that was associated with that. And when he was researching, and he was talking to all the surviving members of the original Black Panthers, and I said to him, did any of them ever say, who the hell are you? This nerdy little honky coming around asking us about that stuff, what the hell do you know about it? And my friend said, funny you asked that, because I asked them that. When I visit them, he says they'd always, they'd look at me and they'd be like, okay. And he says, do you have a problem with me being me? And they said, if you knocked on my door 20 or 30 years ago, I probably would have said, who the hell are you? You got some nerve writing about this stuff. But they said, but now it's like, thank God somebody is writing about it, because I've been sitting there waiting for somebody to knock on my door and ask me about this very interesting part of American history, and had to wait till 2015 for it to happen.
Yeah, it's also just electric because those tensions are in the book. Like the page you've got up there, she has a vision when she's very young of her troubles being over when she meets the benefactor in the bottom right-hand panel there.
Right.
But she does meet her, and things don't ultimately go that well. There's tension, there's like power dynamics and stuff. And then there's also the stuff with the gay friends that she has, in the Harlem Renaissance circle that she has, including Langston Hughes and people who are not in the closet or who are not out of the closet, and the various tensions there. So those tensions like crackle in this book, I find.
Yeah, well, thanks.
So maybe some of that tension is good. That uncertainty is good.
And again, just the same with Sanger. When I'm reading all these biographies of her and reading her own stuff, it's like scenes just jump off the page. Now it's another reason why I wanted to do it. This is somebody that I stole from pretty much for the cover, for the title there, Fire, and then the lettering, the Zora Neale Hurston story. I borrowed all of that from this artist who made this invitation to a famous awards party at the very beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. This artist's name is Aaron Douglas, and he was kind of like the go-to artist of the Harlem Renaissance scene. He's most famous for doing really beautiful murals. But yeah, this was, lots of people called this party here. It was hosted by a magazine, Opportunity Magazine. And it's May 1925, and a lot of people considered this event like the coming out party for the Harlem Renaissance.
Nice.
So like here I did a picture of like going across the top. I'm sure I can't remember everybody's names, but going across the top there is W.E.B. Du Bois and Eugene O'Neill, and Carl Van Vechten is there, and Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson and H.L. Mencken. So it was a mixed party, but it was quite a to-do. And everybody there kept saying, this is the beginning of something. This is definitely the beginning of something.
Cool. I want to also ask you about your art. I don't want to lose that. So I was reading some of the old interviews, and one of them, I can't remember who the interview was with, but it had a little excerpt of this one pager you did, and it was you comparing yourself as an artist as a young person and now, and you were like, comics is like a young person's game. And one of the things you said in it was your art is now a parody of yourself or something like that. Do you remember this one pager that I'm talking about? But anyway,
I do remember the one page strip. I don't remember saying it's the strip was I was parodying myself.
That's right. So I was going to ask you, like, do you really feel that? Because sometimes I think what's unique about your writing, unlike your contemporaries, is that there's a frankness about you in person, but also in terms of your comics, where there's not a lot of fishing around for the subtle, whatever. It's like, these are my views or my thoughts or my jokes, and here they are. And so I was wondering how you felt about your art now, like in terms of what I observed. It certainly doesn't have the grit or the texture, all of that seaminess of the earlier stuff, but it's got a kind of clarity. It's got a kind of lexicon that's very much. You've still got the rubbery arms and the anxious expressions and all of that, but at the same time, it's got a kind of smoothness now. You tend to write in 1 or 2 page vignettes. Each of the episodes has a certain kind of length and a beat.
So like when the art looked like that.
Yeah.
Or which was very kinetic, very energetic, and I was. Or like this is almost like the classic example of me drawing like a maniac.
So that messiness is gone for sure.
Yeah, well, it's, I would invest a lot more time trying to on the art and trying to capture all this energy. I was trying to capture the energy that I sensed from old Warner Brother cartoons, Bob Clampett cartoons, and that was like really important to me. And I was kind of amusing myself, entertaining myself, and also seeing how far I could push it. After a while, I started to think, I think I'm pushing it too far. And
in the older stuff, you mean?
Yeah, in the older stuff. So already by the time I was doing Hate, although you couldn't tell so much from this just mere sample page, I already was dialing it back a little bit, but it still had a lot of that energy. And that energy also just came from me being a young man and just having a young man's energy.
Being frazzled.
Yeah, just like, and taking out my frustrations on the page. And as I got older, it made no sense. As the older I got, I didn't feel, like here we're going through time, and and so this is from I don't know what year this is from, 1908 maybe. So it still looks like me. I still draw the way I draw. It's like there's no point for me to suddenly try to come up with a completely new drawing style.
No.
And I still like movement and energy, and that's why I still eschew elbows and knees.
What about the use of really short episodes? I feel like that's pretty much your signature. Like even
I did that in the old Hate stories too. It would be one story, but
yeah, that's true. It
was broken up in scenes,
into days and stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
But the story itself, even though maybe you'd break it up that way, the story itself would run like a good 20 pages. Whereas now,
sure, but I always made sure that a scene began at the top of the page. I've done that my whole life. A scene will never begin on that middle tier. So this is part a page 2 or a page 3 of a scene, because he's in the middle of a dialogue with somebody here. But there at the very end, after Buddy gets punched in the face, right there, that's end scene.
Right.
And then so when you switch next, it's going to be back at his apartment. It looks like it's in a bar somewhere. And I've always done that. When I write it out, I make sure that every single scene starts right at the top of the page. So it's always been broken up that way.
Cool. We could open it up to the audience soon, but I have a couple of sort of jokey questions, if that's okay. To ask you.
Sure.
He says okay. I'm not sure. Have you ever played the game Fuck, Marry, Kill?
I know what it is. I don't know if I've ever actually played it.
Okay,
just because it sounds so stupid. But
This is going to be your first time playing it.
Oh, boy.
Usually it's like with celebrities, but I'm going to give you Margaret Sanger, Zora Neale Hurston, and Isabel Patterson. Fuck, marry, kill.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I have to kill one of them? Holy smokes, they were all, first of all, they're all totally equally, just based on their real lives, they were both terrible. All three of them are horrible marriage material. You know?
So if you had to marry one, which one would you say?
Oh, geez, I couldn't. Of the three of them? Well, but that's just it. You couldn't stay married to them. They wouldn't stay married to anybody. If marrying them means you're going to get divorced.
Okay, so
that's a really tough
who
one.
would you most want to have a one-night stand with?
Oh boy, I think that also would be a tie with all three.
So maybe a foursome? Yeah. Is that what you're saying? No,
this question. And who would I kill? None of them. It's like, boy, that's an impossible.
Okay,
I'm not trying to bail. That's that's impossible for me to play with these.
I'll give you a different. Okay, Fantagraphics, Dark Horse, Drawn and Quarterly. Fuck, marry, kill.
Well, if you have to, of course you'd kill Dark Horse.
Why?
Because they're Dark Horse. You know? Okay. No, I mean, I did have a good working relationship with them. But it's just that, it's only because Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly are my favorite publishers.
Sure.
It's a bit. I mean, I like them a lot too. They publish an awful lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
But again, if you're telling me which one, as far as like marrying or having sex with, all I can think of is like the people who work at these places. How do you fuck a publishing company? You know. So again, I'm passing. Yeah. I'm bailing on that.
That's cool. We should open it up. Does anybody have any questions or comments for Peter?
What's the reaction like in Europe or other parts of the world if you think?
So what's the reaction been like to you in Europe or other parts of the world?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I've been published in a lot of different languages, and not all of the, mainly Hate. When Hate started, it was like in German and all the Scandinavian languages, Italy, France, and Spain. But in no language did it really take, except for Spain. I'm incredibly popular in Spain. I'm more, like, just on average, I'm more famous.
Is it because some of the stuff is lost in translation?
Yes.
Nuances of the dialogue?
That is exactly it. I couldn't figure out why the Spanish edition does so much better. And then I suddenly realized, well, first of all, I'm friends with my Spanish translator, who is from Spain. But every time he would translate something of mine, and now this one publishing company, La Cupola, they've reprinted and translated everything I've ever done, and they're already working on a translation of this book. The translator either calls me up or he writes to me, and he asks me all these questions like, what does this expression mean? What does this mean? Who is this person? And it's interesting, like he would write to me and say, for example, he'd say, who is Rush Limbaugh? And so I would tell him who
Aren't you lucky you don't know?
Well, I would tell him who Rush Limbaugh is, and like the role he plays in American society, and who likes him and who hates him. And he'd go, oh, okay, because he says he goes, that's good. He goes, we have the equivalent in Spain. There's Rush Limbaughs in Spain. So he goes, I could swap out the name of a Spanish Rush Limbaugh. He says, I did. And I go, okay, well, there you go. And he would ask me endless questions like that. Slang. He would ask me a lot of questions about slang. But then I thought, with all the other languages I've been translated into, when they'd come to the same line, when the Italian translator comes to Rush Limbaugh, I wondered, what did he write? Well, he didn't know who Rush Limbaugh was either. What did he put in there?
Well, you could have Googled Rush.
This is before Google,
okay.
But this is just for example. This is like in the 90s. It's like, what the hell did all... And that's still the case. Like, nobody even told me. I just suddenly found out there's a French edition of Woman Rebel. But again, the same thing. My Spanish translator asked me a million questions about the Sanger book. Who is this? Why is this important? What's it? John D. Rockefeller the second? Is he the guy that started the company? It's like, no, I had to explain the difference between the Rockefellers. He goes, okay. And at the same time, it's like, this is important to know. You should know this stuff. And then, I get this check, and I go, what's this check for? And they said it's for the French edition that's about to come out. And I'm like, the French translator didn't ask me one question, And then, of course, they're going to be like, it didn't sell well. We're not going to do any more Pete Bagge comics.
I would think that the French would love your stuff because it just looks just visually so much like the bande dessinée that I sometimes see.
Right.
The color. And by the way, does your wife do the color? Because I think the color is fantastic in your
Well,
work.
what happens is the way I work with my wife is if there's anything that has to be a certain color, like I would read in one of her biographies, Zora Neale Hurston's car was yellow. She had a car that she named Sassy Susie, and it was yellow. Again, flamboyant. Everything she did was flamboyant. So then when you get to a page that had the car, I tell my wife, it's very important, her car has to be yellow. Make sure it's yellow. And I go beyond that, just wing it. Anything else that has to be a color, I tell her. And so, and that allows, she likes to, the number one reason I like her coloring my work is she's much better at coming up with a color scheme. With me, it'd be garish, and there'd be like too much red over here and too much blue
She's
down
really
here.
good.
And she spots all the colors really well. So
really nice balance. Yeah.
and then what I do is when she's all done, then I sit down, and sometimes I won't change a thing, but other time I might add even little highlights. I might add color to somebody's cheek. If there's any sculpting that's being done, I'll do that. Or else she might I would have forgotten to tell her, like I might have told her, Langston Hughes' hat was always blue, and I'll remember that, so I'll make it blue.
Do we have any more questions?
How do you stay disciplined to do work when you're at home? Do you have a schedule you follow?
Yeah, well, it's not like an alarm goes off, when I'm racing to the drawing table, and sometimes, but I draw pretty much every day, or work. I work every single day. It's like even I figured, does everybody here know who Chris Ware is? I could tell looking at his work. I think we were talking about this yesterday. You can tell by looking at his work, this guy is a workaholic. He must be working all the time. And so one time when I saw him, I asked him, I said, on Christmas, you get up in the morning, and it's Christmas Day, so you got nothing to do except you open up the presents and wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and then you have a great big breakfast, and then you clean the place up, throw away all the wrapping paper. But I'm like, then what? And I said, I go back to work. My studio is right there. It's like, what do I do? Sit here and stand at the walls, or do I just go and work? That's just it. It's like, I don't hate my job. I like my job. It's like I invented my job. So it's like, I'll just go in there and do it. And Christopher was like, yeah, Thanksgiving, yeah. It doesn't matter if it's a holiday, Groundhog Day, I'm drawing.
The guy outside has told me
We have to
get
clear
kicked
out.
out.
Okay.
So let's give him a round of applause.
One more question?
Do you have any other creative releases besides your comics?
Well, I have a band. I'm in a band. I really like doing that. But I guess that's it.
And if people have other questions, they can come to your table. They'll be there for the next hour, right?
Yeah, at least the next hour.
You can see his art, which is quite nice. Buy something?
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Peter.
I think all these people have been to my table.
That's great.
But anyhow, thanks a lot.
Peter Bagge's site is peterbagge.com. That's Bagge. Fire and Woman Rebel are both published by Drawn and Quarterly. You can write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look up Deconstructing Comics on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The most recent episode of Critiquing Comics is behind this episode in the podcast feed. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Polls, We wipe our eyes with our bat hankies as we see off Julie Newmar in her last appearance as Catwoman in the Catwoman Goes to College arc. Look up To the Bat Poles wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. Next week, Kumar and I discuss Sunny Liu's History of Singapore, cleverly disguised as a comics creator biography, The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.